It's time now for the political analysis of Fromm and Fuller. Al Fromm, former political advisor to President Bill Clinton, and Craig Fuller, former political advisor to both President Ronald Reagan and George H.W. Bush. Good morning, all. Al, while there could be a few lawsuits that might potentially hold up Maryland's redistricting map that was engineered by state Democrats, it seems almost certain now that the Maryland 1st District seat currently occupied by Representative Andy Harris will add portions of Anne Annarudul County for the 2022 midterm election. You know, as you know, at least in recent history, the first has been the sacrificial lamb that the Democrats have given the GOP, which has allowed the Trump supporting congressman to win re-election without serious opposition. But does this new map change things? Could the 1st District be in play in 2022?
I think the 1st District will be more competitive. So in a sense, it'll be in play, but that Andy Harris should probably still be the favorite. The district's clearly more Democratic than it was, but I suspect that that alone is not going to be enough to flip the seat. The outcome is likely to be determined by other factors, most importantly, the national political mood and President Biden's approval ratings. The old district voted for Donald Trump by 20 points. The new district voted for Biden, but by less, by less than half a point. So really, it was a dead heat. People who have studied the district, like Dave Wasserman of the Cook Report, believe the Biden vote is likely the ceiling for Democrats and not the floor. Cook does a partisan voter index where he looks at every district, or now Amy Walter is head of it, but they look at every district and decide whether it's Republican or Democratic leaning. In this district, according to the PVI, is still Republican. It's +4 Republican, down from +14, so that's a big shift. That was achieved because Democrats moved Democratic voters from Harford County, Anne Arundel and Harford counties, the suburban parts, away from the districts that are now held by John Sarbanes and Dutch Ruppersberger. And interestingly enough, now those districts, both of them, are less than 10% Democratic. The Cook Report still has the 1st District leaning Republican. And Harris could be helped because by his Democratic opponent, she's Heather Mazier, likely anyway, to be Heather Mazier, who's a progressive who represented liberal Tacoma Park in the legislature and then moved to the Eastern Shore a few years ago to start an organic herb farm. And she's the kind of candidate who could be attractive for the Republicans to attack. So I'd say unless Biden's approval ratings improve dramatically, or Harris becomes such an unacceptable anathema to 1st District voters, he'll probably squeak by. He'll have a race, he'll have to work it, but redistricting alone won't bring him down.
Craig, you've been following the 1st District since you moved here. What's your take on things?
Yeah, I'm enjoying this because, as you know, some of our viewers suggest that Al and I should differ more often, and so now we've got one where I'm inclined to believe that Andy Harris is much more vulnerable this time around. I have to agree. At best, it's close. In full disclosure, a few years ago, I saw a candidate, Jesse Colvin, a Democrat, who wanted to challenge Harris. And like a lot of Republicans here, especially in Talbot County, we got very much involved in Jesse Colvin's race. And in some ways, it's important to remember that this 2022 race is one of these off-year elections. So you don't have a president presidential contest bringing out as many voters, making the enthusiasm for a candidate, I would argue, a bigger factor. I sit here in the first district and find, I don't know Mr. Harris, but I find the actions of our incumbent congressman anywhere from puzzling to embarrassing most of the time. This is an individual who, by the way, ran on firm believer in term limits until he found he had a district he could keep winning in, and then he decided to just keep running. If you Google him, he makes more press by trying to bring a gun into the Capitol than by anything he actually does inside the Capitol, except possibly get into arguments with his colleagues. And he rarely is involved in any legislation. In fact, I remember when Jesse Colvin was running and we were trying to figure out what he actually had done, that he struggled to get a post office named after a fairly distinguished veteran. So I mean, it sets up as a very weak incumbent, but in a district heretofore that was totally structured, as Al said, for a Republican congressman. While it's not entirely settled, the combination of adding more Democrats to the Maryland 1st District and especially taking away Republicans in some of these counties from the district has to make this a closer contest. And even with the district, as it was, while he won re-election against this Democrat, Jesse Colvin, Colvin carried Talbot County, which says to me that there are enough Republicans spread throughout the Maryland 1st District that are frustrated that if the balance changes and there's an attractive Democrat, that attractive Democrat could well win. It will be a test of what we've talked about before, of whether a kind of a Trump clone, if you will, totally adherent to Trump's philosophy, totally espousing election fraud as Trump does, whether that kind of a Republican can win in a general election. As Trump says, time will tell. But I'm looking for a possible upset here. We'll know more in November.
Al, just to be clear with our audience, Annapolis, the city of Annapolis, is not part of this new map. And so what we have is, in many cases, suburban Anne Arundel County, which 2 years in the last election was decisive for Biden in terms of suburban mothers, in particular, women. But now we see Biden significantly declining in those communities, maybe because of COVID, but it's not the same as it was a year ago.
Oh, I mean, that was my point. I mean, what I said is that if unless Andy Harris is such an anathema to 1st District voters that they don't want to return him, redistricting won't beat him. And part of the reason for that is what you just said. I mean, the Biden vote was probably a ceiling for Democrats in those areas. And I think there's some similar areas in Harford County. But you're right, it's not the city of Annapolis. In fact, there were some people some Democrats who were concerned that with very slight changes, that probably would have gone into Mfumi's district and redone Sarbanes a little bit. You could have had a 15 plus Biden district for Andy Harris. I think, probably some of the incumbents would not have liked that as much, but I think the legislature was also probably a little bit more concerned about having the Republican district, what used to be the Republican district, uncompetitive when it went to court. So that would, so I think Maryland Democrats probably took sort of a less aggressive pose than Democrats have taken in other places. In New York, for example, the Democrats went from a 19 Democrat, 8 Republican current breakdown to what's likely to be 22-3. And over the country, the Democrats have taken a pretty aggressive strategy, and While I think most observers expected the Republicans to gain more than the 5 seats they needed to take control out of redistricting, that probably is not going to be the case. It's more a wash. What the Democratic strategy was to put more, sort of what they did here, put more seats in play. And if you look at the number of seats that have gone from slightly Republican to slightly leaning Democrat, there are more of those than there are the other way around. In other words, in the swing seats, Democrats created more Democratic leaning swing seats than Republicans created for themselves. But but that's only part of the question, because there are more Democrats in those seats. And those seats are they're all swing seats. I think only 1 or 2 of them have more than a 5-point party advantage. And those are the seats that most quickly go in a tied election. So if this is a wave election and the Republicans do as well as they look like they're going to do, if Biden doesn't improve, that Democratic strategy could actually backfire and they could lose more. On the other hand, if Biden comes back, they may have a chance to cut their losses.
Craig, could you see Representative Harris somewhat modifying his more extreme pro-Trump rhetoric as a result of this district change, or do you just feel like he can move ahead with such a extremist position as he usually takes?
Well, one would ordinarily think that the rhetoric could be modified. I just don't think Andy Harris has it in him to move much from the positions he holds, and he has been more active in terms of, we get more phone calls. He shows up a little bit more to events. He's a little more present. He's doing that sort of thing, but I don't think he's going to be too successful at changing his spots, and certainly the opposition is not going to allow him to do that. I do think there's just a larger question in all this, and I'm a former political science major. Gerrymandering's been around a long time, but this computer assisted redistricting, where you can kind of go block by block, house by house, and make these calculations and create very homogeneous congressional districts, I think poses some larger problems and questions. For one thing, it creates these situations where for a long time in the first district, the congressman hasn't really had to be very responsive to most of us, because he was assured a safe seat and could conduct himself in a manner that wasn't consistent with what a lot of even Republicans thought was reasonable. But he didn't fear defeat. And I just don't know that representative government is well served by the kind of technology now that creates safety for well over 90% of the members of Congress who seek re-election. There are consequences to that. There ought to be more accountability to your district, and these sort of assured re-elections, I think don't give us necessarily better government. And the question then is, well, what's the answer to gerrymandering? And I think we really, whether it's bipartisan commissions or other approaches that have been tried, it really is time to try to improve the manner in which we draw these boundaries.
Al, you have the last word.
Well, I agree with Craig. It's a real problem because there are, I believe, and I can't remember the exact number, but there are going to be more safe seats in the next Congress than there were in this one. And that causes 2 problems. One, it makes the only race for these candidates in the primaries, and which allows the most extreme candidates to run in the primaries, and it probably widens the partisan gulf. And secondly, once they get elected, they have no interest in working with the other party, because their seat is it will only be jeopardized because they're more likely to be primaried if they do.
Al Fromm, Craig Fuller, thanks so much. We'll see you next week.